Welcome. Tonight's story is not just about one broken mind, but an entire bloodline slowly unraveling across generations. Before we descend into the horrifying secret of the Moorfield family, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, because these stories travel farther when we hear from you. And if you appreciate the countless hours spent digging through real records, testimonies, and forgotten documents to bring true darkness to light, make sure you subscribe, because stories like this don't surface easily. Now, lower your guard, because some families don't inherit wealth or land, they inherit madness. The Moorfield family was once admired, respected, even envied, but whispers followed their name long before anyone dared speak openly. At first, it was subtle, strange behavior, violent mood swings, sudden disappearances explained away as illness or travel. But as decades passed, a disturbing pattern emerged, generation after generation, showing the same symptoms, the same uncontrollable urges, the same descent into insanity. Doctors were baffled, neighbors were terrified, and authorities often arrived too late. Journals recovered from abandoned estates spoke of voices, blood rituals, and a belief that madness was not a curse, but a calling. What made the Moorfields truly horrifying wasn't just their actions, but the growing realization that none of it was random. The insanity was inherited, nurtured, and protected within the family itself. And by the time outsiders understood the truth, the Moorfield name had already vanished, leaving behind only graves, unanswered questions, and a legacy too disturbing to erase. The Moorfield bloodline began quietly, almost unremarkably, in the late 17th century, when Elias Moorfield first settled on a stretch of isolated land far from any growing town. Records describe him as intelligent, disciplined, and deeply private, a man who avoided community gatherings and preferred the company of books and solitude. To outsiders, this seemed like the harmless eccentricity of a learned man, but those closest to him later recalled long nights where lights burned until dawn and strange sounds drifted from his estate, sounds no one could quite explain. Elias married late, choosing a woman nearly half his age, and from the beginning their household followed unsettling rules. Servants were dismissed quickly, often without explanation, and no one was allowed beyond certain rooms of the house. Church records note that Elias attended services regularly, yet never spoke to anyone afterward, leaving immediately as if fearful of lingering. Even then, rumors began to spread that something about the Moorfield home felt wrong, as though the air itself carried unease. Their first children were born healthy, but observers noted unsettling traits early on. Infants who did not cry when injured, toddlers who stared for hours at nothing, and children who displayed sudden, explosive violence without remorse. Elias documented everything obsessively, filling journals with observations not of affection, but of experimentation. He wrote as though he was studying a condition, not raising a family, convinced that something rare flowed through his blood. As the Moorfield name expanded, so did the strangeness attached to it. Relatives who married into the family often vanished from records within a few years, sometimes officially listed as deceased, other times erased entirely. Property deeds reveal that Elias deliberately kept the bloodline tightly controlled, discouraging outside marriages and insisting that cousins wed cousins to preserve purity. At the time, this was dismissed as arrogance, but later generations would recognize it as something far darker. Local physicians were occasionally summoned to the Moorfield estate, yet none stayed long. Some left without collecting payment, others abruptly relocated to neighboring counties. One doctor's personal notes, recovered decades later, mentioned unsettling conversations with Elias about inherited defects and the beauty of unraveling minds. Shortly after writing this, the doctor's name disappears entirely from public documents. When Elias died, the family did not mourn publicly. There was no funeral open to the community, only a brief notice in church records marking his burial on Moorfield land. Control of the estate passed seamlessly to his eldest son, who continued his father's practices without question. By then, the foundation had already been laid, the belief that madness was not an affliction, but a legacy to be protected and passed on. Looking back, historians now agree that the true horror of the Moorfield family did not begin with violence or tragedy, but with intention. From its very origin, the bloodline was shaped by a man who believed insanity was something to cultivate, not cure. What followed in later generations was not coincidence, but consequence, madness carefully planted at the roots of the family tree. The early signs of inherited insanity within the Moorfield family were subtle enough to be ignored, yet consistent enough to leave a trail of unease behind them. Children across multiple generations displayed behaviors that doctors at the time struggled to classify. Long periods of silence, followed by sudden, uncontrollable rage, or an eerie calm during moments that should have caused fear. Family letters reveal that these traits were often dismissed as temperament or intelligence, allowing the pattern to continue unchecked. As the children grew older, the similarities became harder to deny. Night terrors plagued them well into adulthood, accompanied by vivid hallucinations that described the same shadowed figures and whispered commands. What disturbed observers most was that these experiences were nearly identical, even among relatives who had never met. The family treated these episodes not as symptoms, but as rites of passage, something every true Moorfield was expected to endure. Physical punishment or emotional discipline had no effect on the afflicted children. Instead, attempts to correct their behavior often triggered violent outbursts of startling intensity. Caretakers reported being bitten, scratched, or attacked without warning, while the children showed no signs of regret afterward. Medical notes from midwives and tutors quietly mention absence of empathy, a phrase rarely used so openly in that era. One particularly chilling pattern involved the children's fascination with pain, both their own and that of others. Minor injuries were met with curiosity rather than distress, and several accounts describe young Moorfields deliberately reopening wounds to observe bleeding. Family elders encouraged secrecy, insisting that such tendencies were private matters, never to be discussed beyond the household walls. As adolescence approached, the symptoms deepened rather than faded. Mood swings intensified, paranoia took hold, and many developed obsessive behaviors centered around bloodlines, purity, and legacy. Journals kept by multiple generations show an identical fear that losing control meant becoming less Moorfield, as though sanity itself were a betrayal of ancestry. Teachers who attempted to educate Moorfield children often resigned abruptly, citing inexplicable dread or unnatural atmospheres within the home. Those who stayed longer noticed that every child, regardless of era, exhibited the same handwriting quirks, the same violent doodles, and the same fixation on death. These similarities could not be explained by upbringing alone. By the time adulthood arrived, the signs of inherited insanity were unmistakable. What began as strange childhood habits matured into full psychological collapse, hallucinations, delusions of grandeur, and uncontrollable impulses. Yet within the Moorfield family, these symptoms were not hidden in shame. They were acknowledged quietly, accepted fully, and passed forward like an heirloom, proof that the madness was not learned, but born. As generations of the Moorfield family came and went, the most disturbing realization was not that insanity appeared repeatedly, but that it followed the same precise pattern every time. Birth records, private letters, and confiscated journals reveal identical progressions of behavior: quiet childhood detachment, adolescent obsession, and eventual violent instability. This repetition spanned nearly 2 centuries, making coincidence impossible and raising terrifying questions about what truly flowed through the family's vein. Each generation seemed to experience its descent at roughly the same ages. Around 7 or 8, Moorfield children began withdrawing from others, preferring isolation and long hours of silent observation. By their teenage years, fixation replaced curiosity on death, blood, and lineage. Adulthood then marked the final stage, where internal chaos spilled outward in the form of cruelty, manipulation, or murder. The consistency was so exact that later family members could predict their own unraveling. Even the language used to describe these changes remained unchanged across time. Journals from different centuries contain the same phrases: the awakening, the calling, and the noise behind the eyes. These expressions appear in documents written decades apart by relatives who never shared a household. Historians believe these were not taught terms, but shared experiences emerging naturally from the same inherited condition. The repetition extended beyond behavior into choice. Moorfield heirs repeatedly selected the same professions, medicine, theology, or law, not out of passion, but for access to authority and secrecy. Marriage patterns also mirrored one another, with spouses chosen for obedience rather than affection, ensuring the family's control remained intact. Children born outside strict expectations were quietly erased from records. Violence, when it occurred, followed the same chilling structure. Incidents were impulsive yet ritualistic, often involving the same tools, methods, and locations on Moorfield land. Several crime reports described nearly identical scenes, separated by decades, as if one act were echoing another through time. Authorities failed to connect these events, unaware they were witnessing a generational loop. Attempts to break the cycle always failed. A handful of Moorfield descendants fled the estate, changed names, and sought normal lives elsewhere. Yet records show that many later resurfaced in asylums or prisons, displaying the same symptoms as those who remained. Distance could not undo what was already written into their minds. In the end, the repeating patterns became the family's most damning evidence. The Moorfields were not victims of chance, environment, or rumor. They were bound by a cycle that reset with every birth. Each generation did not merely resemble the last, it continued it, as though the family itself were a single, unbroken consciousness, doomed to relive the same descent into madness again and again. Violent behavior within the Moorfield family was rarely acknowledged for what it truly was. Instead, it was carefully disguised beneath the language of illness, weakness, or temporary episodes. Bruises on servants were explained as accidents, sudden deaths as fevers, and uncontrollable rages as nervous conditions. In an era where medical understanding was limited, the family exploited that ignorance expertly, turning brutality into something pitied rather than questioned. Doctors called to the estate were guided towards specific conclusions before they ever examined a patient. Family elders described symptoms in carefully chosen terms: fatigue, melancholy, hysteria, while omitting the violent outbursts that preceded their visits. When physicians witnessed something troubling, they were reminded of the family's status and encouraged to record their findings discreetly. Many complied, unwilling to challenge a powerful name. Within the household, violence was reframed as inevitability. Children who attacked animals or injured siblings were not punished but confined, told they were unwell, and must be protected from the outside world. This twisted logic removed responsibility from the individual while allowing the behavior to continue unchecked. Over time, the afflicted learned that their actions carried no real consequences as long as they stayed within Moorfield walls. Some of the most disturbing incidents were hidden behind prolonged illnesses. Family members would disappear from public view for weeks or months, supposedly bedridden, while neighbors reported screams and strange activity from the estate. When the individual finally re-emerged, any victims, often servants or distant relatives, were gone, dismissed, or buried under vague explanations. Illness became a curtain behind which violence thrived. Mental institutions were also used strategically. On rare occasions when an act drew too much attention, the Moorfields would voluntarily commit one of their own, presenting it as a tragic case of hereditary weakness. These stays were often brief, ending once public suspicion faded. Records show that many returned home unchanged, their violent tendencies simply refined by new knowledge gained inside the institutions. The family's private writings reveal how deliberate this concealment was. Journals speak of masking the impulse and redirecting the storm inward when eyes are watching. Violence was not something to be cured, but something to manage, timed, controlled, and released only when it could be safely hidden. Illness was never the cause, it was the excuse. By hiding brutality behind the veil of sickness, the Moorfields ensured their legacy survived far longer than it should have. Authorities hesitated, communities sympathized, and victims were forgotten. What appeared to be a tragic family plagued by poor health was, in truth, a lineage that learned how to disguise cruelty as frailty, and used that disguise to pass their violence quietly from one generation to the next. Among the most unsettling remnants of the Moorfield family are the journals and letters they left behind, documents never meant for public eyes. These writings were not emotional confessions or personal reflections, but meticulous records, cold and observational in tone. Generation after generation documented thoughts, urges, and behaviors with disturbing precision, as though insanity itself were a subject of study rather than a personal affliction. Many of these journals begin in childhood, written at the urging of family elders. Young Moorfields were instructed to record dreams, violent thoughts, and moments of emotional detachment in detail. What should have been private fears became data, collected and preserved. The handwriting often changed abruptly during adolescence, growing sharper, more frantic, as if the mind behind it were beginning to fracture. Letters exchanged between relatives are even more chilling. Rather than expressing concern, family members compared symptoms, noting similarities with past generations. Phrases like, "The signs have begun," and "He hears it now, as we all did," appear repeatedly. There is no panic in these words, only recognition, as if madness were a predictable milestone, no different from adulthood or inheritance. Several journals describe acts of violence with eerie calm. Authors detailed sensations rather than guilt, how their pulse slowed, how clarity replaced confusion, how silence followed the act. In some cases, these entries are followed by instructional notes written by older relatives, advising restraint, timing, and secrecy. Violence was not condemned, it was refined. What makes these writings especially disturbing is their consistency. The same metaphors, symbols, and phrases appear across centuries. References to blood calling, veins humming, and the family voice. Historians believe this shared language emerged naturally from similar psychological experiences, not from imitation. It suggests that whatever afflicted the Moorfields expressed itself in nearly identical ways each time it surfaced. Some letters hint at fear, but not of madness itself. Instead, writers expressed dread at the possibility of change, of becoming normal, of losing the connection to their lineage. One descendant wrote that sanity felt like rotting from the inside, a betrayal of those who came before. To the Moorfields, insanity was identity. When these journals were finally uncovered after the family's disappearance, authorities struggled to process what they revealed. They were not the writings of isolated lunatics, but of a coordinated lineage documenting its own decay with intention and pride. In ink and paper, the Moorfields left behind undeniable proof that their madness was not hidden in shadows. It was written, shared, and preserved as the most important inheritance of all. Doctors who encountered the Moorfield family were often confident when they first arrived, armed with the medical theories of their time and reassured by the family's polished manners. Yet that confidence rarely lasted. Initial examinations revealed symptoms that did not fit cleanly into known diagnoses: hallucinations without fever, violence without delirium, and emotional detachment untouched by treatment. What baffled physicians most was the uniformity of these symptoms across ages and individuals, as though they were observing the same patient reborn repeatedly. Many doctors attempted conventional explanations, blaming nervous disorders, melancholia, or inherited weakness of the mind. Treatments were prescribed: bleeding, isolation, sedatives, religious counseling, but none produced lasting change. In private notes, several physicians admitted that symptoms temporarily subsided only to return stronger, more focused, and more dangerous. The madness did not progress randomly. It followed a structure no medical text could explain. Some physicians grew uneasy not just with the patients, but with the family itself. Elias Moorfield and his descendants asked unsettling questions, probing doctors about heredity, brain defects, and whether the soul could be altered through blood. These conversations reversed the usual roles, making the physicians feel studied rather than authoritative. A few wrote that the family seemed disappointed when no clear diagnosis could be given. Records show a troubling pattern. Doctors who stayed too long abruptly withdrew from practice. Some relocated without notice, others destroyed their notes, and a handful vanished entirely from professional registries. One physician's final letter to a colleague described the Moorfields as a contradiction to medicine itself, warning that continued involvement would lead only to ruin of certainty. After sending that letter, he was never heard from again. Those who attempted to involve outside authorities faced resistance cloaked in respectability. The Moorfields' wealth and influence discouraged deeper inquiry, and physicians who raised alarms were quietly discredited. Accusations of hysteria, incompetence, or religious extremism followed them, ensuring their warnings were dismissed. Medicine failed not only due to ignorance, but because it was outmaneuvered. Over time, some doctors began to suspect that the condition was not purely medical at all. Notes recovered later suggest theories of intentional psychological conditioning layered atop inherited defects, a combination no one knew how to treat. Yet these ideas were considered too radical, too disturbing, and were abandoned before they could be explored further. In the end, the doctors did not fail because they lacked skill, but because the Moorfield madness defied the foundations of medical understanding. It could not be cured, categorized, or even fully observed without consequence. Each failed explanation added to the family's legend, reinforcing the belief that what plagued them was beyond science, a legacy that medicine could witness, but never touch. The Moorfield estate itself became a character in the family's history, an isolated structure shaped as much by secrecy as by stone. Hidden corridors, locked chambers, and rooms absent from official blueprints were not accidents of old architecture, but deliberate design. From the outside, the house appeared stately and orderly, yet inside it functioned like a maze meant to confuse, conceal, and contain. Visitors often reported losing their sense of direction, even after being guided through only a few rooms. Certain areas of the estate were permanently sealed, their doors reinforced and marked only by subtle symbols scratched into the wood. Family members referred to these spaces in hushed tones, never by name, and servants were forbidden to approach them. Generations passed without anyone outside the bloodline knowing what lay behind those doors, those sounds, muffled voices, rhythmic tapping, sudden impacts were sometimes heard at night. Isolation was enforced not just physically, but socially. Moorfield children were rarely allowed beyond the estate grounds, and, when they were, it was under strict supervision. Friendships were discouraged. Education was conducted privately, and any sign of emotional attachment to outsiders was swiftly corrected. The family believed that exposure weakened control, and control was everything. These sealed rooms served multiple purposes. Some were used to confine family members during violent episodes, others to conduct rituals recorded only in journals. One recovered floor plan suggests that certain rooms were designed without windows or ventilation, ensuring complete sensory deprivation. Those confined inside often emerged changed, quieter, colder, or dangerously calm. Servants who worked closest to these areas never stayed long. Many resigned without explanation, while others left behind letters describing unbearable dread and the feeling of being watched from within the walls. A few vanished entirely, their employment records ending abruptly. The family dismissed such incidents as superstition or personal weakness. Over time, the estate itself began to decay in uneven ways. While public rooms were meticulously maintained, isolated wings were left to rot, sealed off as though abandoned intentionally. Floors sagged, walls blackened, and mold spread unchecked. The family made no effort to restore these sections, treating decay as a form of preservation rather than neglect. In later years, when authorities finally entered the Moorfield estate, they found rooms that felt untouched by time, yet heavy with it. The silence inside was unnatural, pressing, as though it remembered every scream it had swallowed. The house had done its job well, serving as both shield and accomplice, ensuring the family's horrors remained isolated, hidden and sealed away, just long enough to become legend. From an early age, Moorfield children were taught beliefs that no outsider would have considered normal. These ideas were not presented as superstition or fear, but as unquestionable truths woven into daily life. Elders spoke calmly about blood as memory, about thoughts that traveled through generations, and about madness as proof of belonging. Children learned quickly that to question these teachings was to question the family itself. Stories were used as instruction. At night, instead of fairy tales, children heard accounts of ancestors who heard the calling and embraced it, contrasted with those who resisted and met terrible ends. Sanity was portrayed as weakness, a surrender to the outside world. Madness, by contrast, was framed as clarity, an awakening that separated true Moorfields from ordinary people. These beliefs were reinforced through ritual. Certain birthdays marked moments of transition, where children were isolated for hours or days and encouraged to listen inward. Journals describe elders watching closely for changes afterward: new detachment, heightened aggression, or emotional coldness. When these traits appeared, they were celebrated quietly, treated as signs that the child was developing correctly. Language played a powerful role in shaping obedience. Violent urges were renamed as inheritance, hallucinations as guidance, and lack of empathy as strength. By redefining symptoms, the family removed fear from the experience of madness. Children did not feel broken, they felt chosen. This psychological framing ensured that resistance rarely took root. Punishment existed, but not for cruelty. It was reserved for empathy, attachment, or doubt. Children who expressed guilt or compassion were isolated, lectured, or subjected to prolonged silence from the family. Over time, they learned which emotions were acceptable and which were dangerous. Love was weakness. Curiosity was dangerous. Obedience was survival. As these children grew into parents themselves, they passed the same beliefs forward without hesitation. Journals show little variation in tone across generations, suggesting the teachings had become automatic, no longer questioned even internally. What began as indoctrination hardened into instinct. By the time the Moorfield bloodline reached its later generations, the beliefs were no longer taught, they were assumed. Madness was identity, cruelty was tradition, and doubt was betrayal. The family did not simply inherit insanity, they raised it, protected it, and ensured it would never die quietly. Sudden deaths within the Moorfield family were so frequent that they became almost expected, yet they were never treated with public grief. Records show abrupt endings, falls down staircases, unexplained illnesses, accidental drownings on family land, often clustered around moments of emotional instability or internal conflict. Each death was swiftly documented, quietly buried, and rarely discussed again. What made these deaths unsettling was their timing. They often occurred just as individuals began questioning family beliefs or expressing hesitation toward the inherited madness. Letters hint at relatives who spoke of leaving, marrying outsiders, or seeking help beyond the estate, only for their names to vanish from records shortly afterward. Coincidence was the official explanation. Inevitability was the unspoken truth. Children were not exempt. Several birth and death registries show infants who lived only days or weeks, with causes vaguely attributed to frailty or failure to thrive. Later journals suggest these deaths were sometimes deliberate, reserved for children who showed too much emotional awareness or none of the expected signs. Survival was not guaranteed by blood alone, but by conformity. Burials took place on Moorfield land, often without markers. The family believed that those who died improperly, through doubt, weakness, or resistance, should not be remembered. This erasure extended beyond graves. Personal belongings were destroyed, letters burned, and rooms sealed as if the person had never existed. Death was not an ending, but a correction. Local authorities noticed patterns but lacked proof. Reports of repeated fatalities on one estate raised suspicion, yet each case was supported by plausible explanations and cooperative witnesses from within the household. Without external testimony, investigations stalled. The family's unity became its greatest shield. In some cases, deaths were staged to send messages within the family. Journals refer cryptically to necessary losses and lessons written in silence. Younger members learned quickly that survival depended not just on blood, but on obedience. Death became a tool of reinforcement rather than a tragedy. By the time the Moorfield name faded from public view, its history was already littered with unmarked graves and unanswered questions. The sudden deaths were not anomalies, but mechanisms used to prune the bloodline, preserve control, and ensure that only those fully loyal to the family's horrifying legacy lived long enough to pass it on. Fear of the Moorfield family did not erupt suddenly. It seeped into the surrounding community over decades, carried by whispers rather than accusations. Neighbors spoke cautiously, lowering their voices whenever the estate was mentioned, as though the family could somehow hear them. Children were warned to avoid the road that passed Moorfield land, and travelers were advised not to seek shelter there, no matter how severe the weather. Rumors spread through patterns rather than stories. People noticed how servants arrived healthy and confident, only to leave pale, shaken, or not at all. They noticed how members of the family aged strangely, some appearing untouched by time, while others deteriorated rapidly. These observations were shared in fragments, never assembled aloud into a single truth. Local clergy grew uneasy after repeated confessions that hinted at violence without naming it. Several ministers recorded feeling an oppressive presence when visiting the estate, describing conversations that felt rehearsed, controlled, and emotionally hollow. Over time, clergy visits became rare, and sermons began to include vague warnings about inherited sin and corrupted lineage, messages the congregation understood without names being spoken. Taverns and markets became the unofficial archives of Moorfield fear. There, stories circulated of screams heard at night, of lights moving through sealed wings of the house, of figures wandering the grounds long after midnight. No one claimed certainty, only repetition. And repetition, over time, became belief. Despite this fear, no one intervened. The Moorfields were wealthy, educated, and outwardly polite. Confrontation meant risking employment, reputation, or worse. Silence was safer than truth, and the community learned to coexist with dread rather than challenge it. Occasionally, an outsider would arrive, a trader, a distant relative, a government clerk, and ask too many questions. Locals would offer polite deflection, warning them indirectly to move on. Those who ignored the warnings often left quickly, shaken by encounters they could not explain. By the end, the Moorfield family had become a local legend, not through proven crimes, but through collective avoidance. Fear thrived in the absence of evidence, fed by whispers that no one dared confirm. And in that silence, the family's horrors continued undisturbed, protected by a community that chose survival over truth. The collapse of the Moorfield name did not come with a single scandal or dramatic revelation. It unfolded quietly, almost respectfully. Public records show fewer appearances, fewer transactions, and fewer heirs listed with each passing decade. What had once been a prominent family slowly retreated from society, as though folding in on itself. The estate, once a symbol of permanence, began to fall into neglect. Taxes went unpaid, repairs were abandoned, and entire wings were closed off without explanation. Locals noticed that no new servants were hired, and those who remained were aging, fearful, and increasingly isolated. The house no longer hosted gatherings or conducted business, it simply endured. Within the family, communication fractured. Letters that once circulated between relatives abruptly stopped. Journals from the final generation show confusion rather than control. Entries filled with fragmented thoughts, paranoia, and fear of one another. The carefully maintained structure that had preserved the madness for centuries was unraveling under its own weight. Authorities were eventually drawn in, not by rumors, but by absence. Missed tax filings, unanswered legal notices, and abandoned properties forced intervention. When officials arrived, they found rooms sealed from the inside, documents destroyed, and signs of hasty departures. No bodies were discovered, only evidence of lives abruptly halted. The last confirmed Moorfield heir was seen leaving the estate alone, carrying only a small trunk and several bundled papers. Where they went remains unknown. No further records exist under the Moorfield name after that point, as though the family had chosen erasure over exposure. In the aftermath, the estate was condemned and partially dismantled. Workers reported intense discomfort, refusing to enter certain sections. Many quit after a single day, claiming the house felt occupied. Despite its emptiness, large portions were sealed permanently rather than demolished, left standing as hollow shells. What remained of the Moorfield name was not justice or closure, but disappearance. The family that had devoted itself to preserving madness was ultimately consumed by it. Their legacy ended not with punishment, but with silence, a final retreat into the shadows, leaving behind only fragments of a story too disturbing to fully uncover. The horrifying truth behind the Moorfield bloodline emerged only after everything else was gone. After the estate fell silent, the records fragmented, and the family name vanished. What investigators and historians pieced together was not the story of a cursed family, but of a lineage shaped by choice as much as inheritance. Madness had not simply happened to the Moorfields, it had been identified, embraced, and cultivated from the very beginning. Evidence suggests that a genuine hereditary mental disorder may have existed in the earliest generations, but instead of attempting to limit its impact, the family elevated it into doctrine. Through isolation, indoctrination, and selective survival, the Moorfields amplified the condition rather than diluted it. Over time, biology and belief fused into something inseparable, creating a self-fulfilling cycle that ensured the madness would always return. The journals revealed the clearest insight. Later generations no longer questioned whether they were ill, they feared becoming well. Sanity represented loss of identity, exile from lineage, and betrayal of ancestors. By framing illness as inheritance and cruelty as strength, the family rewired its own understanding of reality. What might have been treatable in one generation became sacred in the next. The estate itself functioned as a closed system, preventing outside influence and reinforcing the internal narrative. Children raised within its walls were denied any alternative worldview, ensuring the family's beliefs went unchallenged. Madness thrived not because it was inevitable, but because it was protected. Perhaps the most chilling realization is that the Moorfields did not see themselves as monsters. They believed they were guardians of something rare, a bloodline untouched by ordinary morality. In their minds, the outside world was fragile and dishonest, while they alone carried truth, no matter how violent or distorted. When the family finally collapsed, it was not due to exposure or justice, but exhaustion. Generations of manipulation, secrecy, and internal violence eroded their ability to sustain control. The system that preserved their horror eventually consumed itself. The true legacy of the Moorfield family is a warning rather than a mystery. It shows how inherited illness, when combined with isolation and belief, can transform into something far more dangerous than madness alone. The horror was never just in their blood. It was in what they chose to believe, protect, and pass on, long after they knew the cost.